Joining this morning's program is author of Rare, the memorabilia collection of a lifetime, one of the leading and credible music memorabilia collectors in the world, Tom Fontaine. Tom, Brian Cattequid, thank you so much for your visit to the program.
It's a pleasure, Brian. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Tom, I skimmed through your book, and I love the title, Rare, and you're a fascinating figure with such an impressive collection of items. How did the hobby begin for you?
Well, thanks for that, but I'll tell you what happened around 1962. My mother brought home a box of cereal, and on the back of it was actually the Hanna-Barbera cards, and I was really intrigued by it because I watched them on, the Saturday afternoon cartoons and everything, and it just intrigued me. I was always a visual kid anyway, and so she was kind enough. She cut them out for me, and I started collecting cards on the back of cereal boxes. And once I found out about the Hanna-Barbera cards, I also found out about all the baseball cards, from the postcards, and then I found out through Jell-O that there were cards on that, and that's what actually started me collecting.
Wow, so you collected baseball cards first, huh?
I did, yeah. I was a kid. Well, what I did was I was the youngest kid in the neighborhood, and so what I did was I'd go down to our local drugstore, McCord's, and I would buy baseball cards, and I would trade with the older kids in the neighborhood, and they would trade me their older cards, and they couldn't understand why I did that. And I thought, well, I kind of liked the vintage cards more than I did the newer cards. So something kind of told me that this was something that was going to be a real passion of mine growing up and staying in collecting, and that's how it all started.
Now, what was it about music memorabilia that appealed to you at an early age?
That was just a fluke. What happened was it was a rainstorm in Indianapolis in the summer, and a couple girls in the neighborhood had these cards, and as they were running for cover in this downpour, a bunch of cards flew up in the air, and they landed on the street, and I saw them, and after the rainstorm was over, I picked them all up, and I put them up, and I dried them all out, and they were all wavy and everything. But I looked and I saw these signatures of George Harrison, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Ringo Starr that was printed on the cards, and I looked into it and I saw it was the Beatles cards. And once I did that, I showed them to my mother, and she said, well, her brother, Johnny, had a grocery store, and she invited me to go to the grocery store and just show them to Johnny, and he said, quote, unquote, oh, that's those doggone Beatle cards all the kids are buying. And I said, well, do you have some? And he said, yeah. So through that entire summer, he threw about 10 or 12 packs in the grocery bag, and that's what started it for me.
Yeah, and those Beatle cards were issued by the Topps Company back in 1964. I've had quite a few of those. Yeah, they're pretty neat looking. Let's talk about some of your most prized possessions in your historic collection, and how were they obtained?
Well, I tell you what, I've been very fortunate to have some incredible items. And I've had Beatles contracts. I've had, I was fortunate enough to have one of the cutouts from the Sgt. Pepper, which was the Tony Curtis, and I met with him in person, and those were really great things. I mean, but the one thing was interesting is that I had the original upright composition piano that was owned by Elton John. And the first 5 albums that he composed on that was on this piano. And I was fortunate enough to have it on loan at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I'm happy to say now that it's in a museum in Calgary for like the history of keyboards. And to have that, it was just something really, really special to have and own it. And how I got about it was actually in an auction several years ago. And then it came over to, and I saw an article of all things in Goldmine magazine, and I inquired about it. And one thing I knew, one thing led to another, and it was all of a sudden it was on my driveway in a big, huge van, and I owned it, and it was really, really cool. But that's one thing that just. The many items I've had is, like I said, I've been very fortunate, but that one really comes to my mind.
Yeah, how much is something like that worth?
Well, it sold in auction back in 2004. I think it was like 100. I think it was like 160, 170 or something like that, and it was. I kind of, in a way, I kind of have a little bit of seller's remorse because I'm such a big Elton John fan. But on the other end, though, I'm so glad it's somewhere where people can actually see it and enjoy it.
Man, did you see the Elton John movie? What did you think about that?
It was interesting because not too many documentaries are made when someone is still alive. Of that nature. I mean, because the Queen, the Bohemian Rhapsody came out, and of course we lost Freddie Mercury, but Elton's still with us, and it's almost felt like it's like a to be continued documentary, a film, because they stopped at a certain point, and gosh, Elton has done so much other things, since then. Especially for the AIDS Foundation and everything like that. I think they may have had some writing at the end about all the different things he's been doing. But I just felt like it was a to-be-continued film, is what I felt.
Yeah, I liked it. He's an amazing entertainer.
Yes.
So you being the expert of rock and roll memorabilia, Tom, let me ask you, how do you determine the value of, let's say, vintage records? Are there a lot of reprints out there? I always wondered, like, what do you have to be careful when buying vintage records? Can you give us some explanation on that?
Yeah, well, obviously years ago before the internet, you really had to really kind of do your homework. Now, I will say this: there were record guides and price guides out there who really knew what they were doing, and I reference to those, or collectors reference to those as well. And I guess what I would try to say as far as like records, the one that comes to my mind is, again, bringing up the Beatles, is the "Can't Buy Me Love" picture sleeve. And I believe the reason why the "Can't Buy Me Love" picture sleeve was so rare is because the Beatles were already on top, and I think they just did a limited distribution of the sleeves, and then a lot of them were just in the stock white capital sleeve, white sleeves, capital sleeves, etc. And that one kind of comes to my mind. But the one thing about it is today, it's made it really, really a lot easier, because I'll tell you what, when I go to record shows or swap meets and things like that, and this is really, really good, I'm so glad to see these kids are buying vinyl now, and what they do is they pull out I've seen them do it, they pull out the records, they go to their phone and look and see what the stock number is and everything like that to see if it's the original or actually a reissue. And unfortunately, years ago, we just didn't have that option. You just had to look into some guides, pull the guides out and everything. But I hope I answered that question, because I would say reprints, I'd say reissues, and you can kind of tell, because when the older albums came out, the texture of the cardboard was different, where a lot of the reissues were almost kind of like a full slick all the way around type surface. And also, too, the stock numbers were different. I mean, that's one of the things that you really, really look real carefully is stock numbers that's on the record and the cover itself, and you can pretty much kind of tell what's an original from a reissue.
Man, because I'm looking at some of the top 10 selling records at auction, and I think the Beatles on the list for like 6 or 7 of them, like the Beatles White Album sold for close to $800,000. The John Lennon and Yoko.
Well, I tell you what it is now this the best thing I can kind of say on that about the White Album is collectors desire very when the White Album came out, there was a stock number underneath it. No, I shouldn't call it a stock number. It was a number of copies that were made, and the first 4 of them, I believe, actually went to all 4 of the Beatles, and probably the rest of them, the first 15, probably went to some of the people that was involved with the Beatles, etc. So that is a very desirable album. I think the one album, I think Ringo Starr's White Album, I think has sold for some good money. And then the ones you mentioned, something about Sgt. Pepper.
Right.
I think they might be talking about the ones that's actually signed by all 4 of the Beatles. I know it broke a record a few years ago. I think it went for about $290,000, but it was signed really nicely in the gatefold by all 4 of the Beatles that commanded that money. But the one thing when you mentioned about the White Album, that's the only thing I kind of know, that the very, very low numbers are very, very desirable to collectors.
I see. And then also the double fantasy, the Lennon and Yoko Ono, that sold for $150,000 at auction. Is there any variations on that album, if you know?
Yeah, if I was guessing, I would have to say that probably that was signed by John and Yoko. There's actually a picture of John in one of the books where he has about a stack of about 5 or 6 double fantasies on his desk and getting ready to sign them. But there were very, very few, because obviously we lost John not too far after that. But he did sign a few of them, and my guess is that double fantasy was probably one that had John Lennon and Yoko Ono's signature on, and they were usually signed on the back.
On the back, okay. Now we're talking to music memorabilia expert Tom Fontaine. Now, Tom, you also have a collection of clothing and wardrobe memorabilia. Can you talk about some of the items in your collection regarding to clothing and wardrobe?
Yes, actually, it was the first thing that I was always wanting to try to find was anything on the Beatles, and you got to be very, very careful with clothing. The Beatles, the manufacturer was Doug Millings. And, there were, they did, like from 63 and 63, 64, 65. I'm fortunate enough to have George Harrison's performance jacket from the 1965 U.S. tour, including the Ed Sullivan Show. And just as a footnote, I actually just attended the Fest for Beatle fans in Chicago last weekend, and I brought the jacket to show to a couple people. And, boy, I tell you what was so really cool about this, Brian. We're all businessmen here, and we're all older adults, but I'll tell you, we all were like kids at Christmas when we were showing it. We were taking pictures of it and everything. And those things come to my mind, but also, too, I've been fortunate enough, which I do have, is Buddy Holly's clothing. I've got personal items of Richie Valens, Johnny Cash's stage outfit. It's amazing. It's kind of a whirlwind, Brian. When someone asks me, how did you get this? It's kind of like, it's amazing to think, to say, well, you know what? It was a day-by-day thing, and certain opportunities came my way. And I always thought, well, if there's an opportunity there, and if it's something I feel like I want to have as a collector, I don't want to let it pass by. Because a lot of times when things pass by, then all of a sudden it's no longer available anymore.
Man, that's amazing. Now, if music memorabilia collectors want to see some of these items, they can see it in your book, right? Talk about your book.
Yes.
I love the title, Rare. I just love that title, Rare.
Thank you.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that. How did that start?
Well, what I decided to do, because I have collected since I was 5 years old, and I decided that a couple things. Number one, I thought, since I've collected all this and I still have the images of them and everything, I wanted to do almost kind of like an homage to all these artists, from music to television to film to sports, because, in one book, to have all those different artists' names and everything like that with a different variety and categories, I'd never seen anything like that before. So what I decided to do, I put myself in a collector's mode as far as like, what would I like to see in a book? And that's what I did. And I kind of tell my story. I do a nice tribute to my family and everything like that, because if it wasn't for them, for me to support me all these years as far as my craziness of collecting all these things, it wouldn't have been possible. But it just, once I'm gone, I hope that this book is around somewhere where someone can basically pick it up and just see a nice tribute to all the artists that basically should be recognized. I mean, we all know about the Beatles, and we know about Elvis, and, Grateful Dead, Led Zeppelin, et cetera, and the list goes on. But, there's the Ronettes, there's Kenny Rogers in the first edition, there's Bobby Fuller 4, there's something like that all incorporated in the book. And if it has their name in there, it doesn't mean that someday somebody may research and find out who they are.
Now, Tom, if someone wants to purchase your book, is there a website they can go to?
You can go to my website, and you can get it is tjfontainecollection.com, or to make it real simple, it's on Amazon. Both my books are on Amazon. I've got the Rare book, and just recently I just did another book called The Beatles in the Solo Years: A Trip Down Memory Lane. And that's actually what consists of is items I used to own in my collection. So what I decided to do was I wanted it to be a good reference book and an historical book in the same thing. So I've got all my material that I had from contracts and signed things and personally owned items, and I put them in a chronological order from the Cavern to the Breakup, and then I also feature John, Paul, George, and Ringo in the same fashion with a couple other stories in between. And those are both available on Amazon.
We're talking to expert Tom Fontaine. Tom, let's talk about autographs. What are some of the rarest autographs you own?
Well, I have a couple signed albums from the Beatles. I've got some really, really nice, Richie Valens from Tacoma Junior High when he performed there on stage. And, of course, we lost Richie at a very early age on February 3rd, 1959 with Buddy and the Big Bopper. I've got his contract. I really love documents as much as I can. Autographed things are absolutely fantastic, too. I've got a lot of Beatles. I've got Elvis. I got Buddy and Richie. I've got Elton John, Monkees. And then I have a Gone with the Wind cassette, and I've got Wizard of Oz. And I even got a drawing, believe it or not, that was done by James Dean. It goes such a wide variety, Brian, of things, and maybe, like I said, maybe later on if we do another show, I can kind of maybe share some things with you as well too. Maybe send things over to you ahead of time, and we can talk a little bit about the history. Because the one thing I really, really like about all this, about the autograph collecting that I try to do, and is really most difficult, is I created relationships with people who basically were there at the time. I mean, comes to mind, this girl went and saw Elvis Presley, and she was backstage. She was backstage outside the door with all these teenagers, and she was like 8 years old. And she walks up to, they're all screaming, and all of a sudden Elvis really saw her, and she just said, "Would you sign my photo?" And he had a big smile on his face and signed the photo. Well, she told me an entire story about it, Brian, and what I try to do is I ask people to share their stories with me on anything they want to do. And sometimes they just think, "Oh, you don't want to hear about this." I said, "I want to hear more." And then the thing of it is, what happens sometimes, Brian, they'll say, "Well, you know what? I also went to the Rolling Stones concert, and I got their signatures. Would you be interested in that too?" So when you develop relationships, it's almost like the domino effect, because then they can contact their friends who were there, and then they contact me and say, "Well, I heard you got this," and so on and so forth. So that's the cool thing about collecting, is the backstory on it, not just because you got the signature and everything, but the backstory is so important, and also it's extremely enjoyable.
Yeah, and trust is very important, Tom, as you know, because, there's a lot of forgery out there.
Without a doubt, and you're right, and trust is important, and research is important, and that's you've got to do your homework. Go to guides. I published a Beatles autograph study back in 2004, and I've gotten several people send me emails and thanking me for it because it helped them when they saw it, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to go to people who kind of, there's a lot of Elvis experts out there, and now because of the internet, it is so beneficial for people to do their research before they put money into something, and that way you feel more comfortable about yourself before you decide to buy something, and that's actually the way to do it. And you're right, trust is is a very important factor in this, and also too, you want to make sure that you've got the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, so many questions I can ask you. How about authentication services for rock and roll memorabilia? Is there any that you know of?
Oh, well, yeah. There's companies out there that actually do it, and they can, you know, I said you can go to the internet, just put Authentication Services, and you know, there's companies out there. There's been companies out there for a long time and everything, and you know, and like I said, I've you know, with myself, I mean, I was around all this, you know, when all this was all developing. See, in my opinion, now this is just my opinion, but things really changed as far as the value of almost all the memorabilia today. I mean, the value, when we lost John Lennon, it seems completely kind of changed, because once they know that John was gone and he wouldn't sign anymore, then it just seemed like the memorabilia values started really escalating. I mean, obviously Elvis passed away yesterday was the anniversary, and he died in 1977. But for some reason, as a collector, since I was been around it all this time, I just felt a different feeling about people wanting to have a piece of history. And maybe because I'm a baby boomer, I'm not really sure, but it just felt like when we lost John, people wanted to grasp something about, and say, wait a minute, now it is too late because he's gone, to start collecting in all sorts of different categories. I mean, right now, today, I've noticed who's really big in the collecting market, as far especially autographs, is Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin has just absolutely skyrocketed because, these people have grown up from the 70s, 80s. They followed Led Zeppelin, and it just goes on and on and on, so it's what's desirable. I hope I answered your question the best I could on that one.
You did. I have a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you your opinion on the most desirable musician autograph to own.
Beatles. By far. I mean, it's still always going to be the Beatles. I mean, right now, like I said, Led Zeppelin is really doing very well in the market. But you got a signed Beatles album by all four, or a contract. Anything that's really Beatles related is still going to stay on the top over everything. Now, again, that's just an opinion, because there's people who grew up with Elvis and they may think it's Elvis. See, that's one thing about it, is when you're talking about these things, it's about opinion, and the best I can do is share what I know, and I hope maybe it's been somewhat educational to the listeners today.
No, it is. I mean, you're in that world. That's why, what you're saying matters. How about the most desirable rock record to own, in your opinion?
Wow. Well, the first one that comes to my mind, again, I'm going to mention the Beatles again, would probably be the My Bonnie on Decca. It's a 45. It's on Decca, and I only think there's just a handful of those out there. But boy, I tell you what, I mean, I know there's some really high-end Elvis Presley and other different artists as well too. But it always started with me with the Beatles. That's the first and foremost. But I did collect the Doors. I collected Hendrix. I collected Janis. I got their magazines when I was a kid and everything like that. So I have some of those things as well too. But the record itself, that's one that kind of comes to my mind, and I imagine if there's listeners out there, they probably say, oh, wait a minute, there's this one and this one and this one. And that's cool, because you know what? That keeps the collecting buzz going. That's what's so cool about collectors. They all have their own opinions on what's good, and it's all enjoyable. How can you knock that? You know what I mean?
No doubt about it. 1 minute. So that's My Bonnie. Last question. One item on your wish list that you want to own.
Absolutely. The first thing that comes to my mind, the Beatles play at the Indiana State Fair in 1964, September 3rd. I've got so many different original pieces of memorabilia, like the press pass and all those things, but I would love to have a set of the 4 autographs that the Beatles signed here in Indianapolis. I don't know if it's out there, but that would be my grail right there.
Tom, I appreciate a few minutes, and we'll do it again.
I would love to do it. I'll be on any time you'd like for me to, Brian.
You got it, and I'll mention your website.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care. The web